Hey, thanks for coming to 1500ESPN.com or YouTube. This is Matthew Coller. I'm Derek Wetmore, and you're watching Vikes Insight. We're going to talk about the Arizona Cardinals-Minnesota Vikings matchup for this weekend and three key players in that matchup. Let's start with the local tie, Larry Fitzgerald. Obviously, people around here know him, Matthew. But what kind of challenges does Larry Fitzgerald still present despite getting up there in age for a receiver?
I would say he is still one of the elite wide receivers in the league that despite being over 30, he has not lost a step at all. Now, one of the things that benefits him is just how many offensive weapons Arizona has. The interesting part about the schedule here that the Vikings have faced as a defense is that this is another team, third team in a row, that has a lot of players that they could throw the ball to and spreads the ball around to a lot of different guys. So Fitzgerald ends up being a little more of a cog in the machine from the past when he played for a lot of bad Arizona teams where it was like they had to throw it to him every single time. So that makes him even more dangerous because it's not just the only guy that you have to focus on as a defense is shutting him down. It's him and then a lot of other weapons as well.
And problematic for the Vikings would be the health of Xavier Rhodes and Terrence Newman if, in fact, one or both of those guys can't go. The Vikings, after having started the season with what we thought was a pretty deep secondary, could really be up against it if they don't have their full complement of players.
Yeah, we saw it last week. Mackenzie Alexander did not play well for the second straight week when he got an opportunity, and I talked to Terrence Newman about that, and Newman said, look, you can only learn by getting in there. I mean, you can practice so much, but every young corner is going to have those tough times, especially a guy who was not drafted in the first round.
Sure.
And even guys who were drafted in the first rounds. Trey Wayans was drafted last year, and he still has his moments. So, but that presents a problem when it is coming down to your must-win games in order to stay at the top or get back to the top of the NFC North, that you're potentially having to put out rookies, second-year players, and guys that are a pretty significant drop-off. If they don't have Rhodes and Newman, that would be their number one and number two corners being down for this game. Now, Rhodes was practicing. Newman was not. We'll see what ends up working out there. But this would be one of those games where you want to have Xavier Rhodes facing off with Larry Fitzgerald the entire game. That's a battle of two guys who are very skilled, and the size of Xavier Rhodes helps him when it comes to facing off with those number one wide receivers.
Two other Cardinals players we have to talk about, and we'll get to David Johnson in a second, but I like what you said about Xavier Rhodes sort of shadowing, and we've seen that in the past, right? Calvin Benjamin, Alshon Jeffrey, Calvin Johnson last year. The Vikings will use Xavier Rhodes to shadow the top receiver on other teams from time to time. The Cardinals are probably going to do that with Patrick Peterson against Stephon Diggs because of the past couple of games, frankly, for Diggs. He's been outstanding. What do you see that matchup? Who's favored there, basically? Because obviously everybody knows Patrick Peterson, great cover corner, and yet Stephon Diggs has also gone up against some good defensive backs and still had his time.
Yeah, well, I think the matchup always favors the wide receiver in today's NFL.
Sure.
Especially because of the amount of penalties that get called when it comes to throwing the ball down the field. It's one thing that when we talk about the West Coast offense that is not a benefit of the West Coast offense is throwing those deep passes and hoping that you end up getting a flag.
Right.
And maybe someday the NFL will change that rule where you could get a 40-yard penalty by just launching it right. I mean, if there's any contact, and it's going at such a high speed. And that's where sometimes you could take advantage of the more physical corners.
Sure.
But in Stephon Diggs' case, most of the throws that have been to him of his last two games, 26 catches, they've been underneath.
Yep.
They've been on short routes. So I think that what Patterson is going to try to do is play very, very physical with Diggs because he's thinking, well, this team doesn't have much of an offensive line, so he's going to have to stay underneath, and I'm just going to do my best to stuff him there.
Yeah.
What the Vikings can do is line him up all over the field and use that to their advantage, that you know that their number one player on defense is tied up with Stephon Diggs, so now who else might be available in their different matchups to use?
And I asked Mike Zimmer about that exact thing, and he mentioned going back all the way back to his Dallas days where he'd have Deion Sanders and they'd try to shadow Jerry Rice all over the field. So you can imagine that this matchup between Patrick Peterson and Stephon Diggs is kind of just old hat for Mike Zimmer. He's nothing new here, whatever. Right. Jerry Rice in primetime, like that's a different story. But anyway, the thing that he said when I asked what makes that challenging, like why wouldn't teams do this all the time? Just put their best cover guy on their best pass catcher and figure out the rest. He said, well, they play a lot of single high safety anyway, so it might not be that different for them. And when you're in man coverage, it's easy. You just go match up and everybody else finds a guy. But if you're in a zone, you can end up with some bad matchups where you've got a linebacker trying to cover a speedy wide receiver, and that's a real mismatch, especially in recent weeks for the Vikings when I don't think Anthony Barr's been playing as well as we've seen. That could present some problems for the Vikings this week, too.
And there's only a number of guys who can actually do it.
Who can cover receivers?
Right, yeah. I mean, if you're a quarterback, if you're Sam Bradford and you're lining up at the line of scrimmage and you're looking at what you have in front of you, a lot of times you look for that one-on-one matchup.
Yep.
And as soon as you see it, you know, I'm going to go to that area unless it's Darrelle Revis in his prime, if it's Patrick Peterson, if it's Xavier Rhodes, then it ends up being a different kind of story because you're looking away from that matchup knowing that their corner can beat your wide receiver a lot of the time or that he's not going to be open. And that's the thing. With Sam Bradford and his reads at the line of scrimmage are going to be huge because he's not going to have much time.
Yeah.
I mean, we're talking about an offensive line that has been taped together with glue and paper clips for the whole season, and now they lose Jake Long.
Yeah.
You're talking about Jake Long, who we weren't even sure could even run or play anymore, was doing halfway decent the last couple of weeks. The key was getting the ball out very, very fast.
Yeah.
And now if your number one target for those quick passes, if he gets taken away by Patrick Peterson, then you're going to have to make quicker reads and look and go through your progressions faster over the field to know where to go next if that isn't there immediately. Yeah,
the Vikings are going to have other problems, of course. Struggled to run the ball all year, even when Adrian Peterson was healthy. And they now have a new kicker. Kai Forbath taking over for the much-maligned Blair Walsh. But you guys will talk about that on this week's episode of the Purple Podcast, so I'll steer clear of that for now and ask you about David Johnson, how he could make life difficult for the Vikings this weekend.
At the very beginning of the year, running backs weren't doing anything against the Vikings. They were shutting down running games using their front four, which was really impressive. Linval Joseph was having a great season. I remember we talked on one of these about how he had a case for MVP of the team.
That's right.
Because he was completely eliminating run games. Well, over the last few weeks, that has not happened. Last week, Washington went for over 100 yards. Chicago went for over 100 yards. Jordan Howard had a huge day. If you're David Johnson, you're looking at a team that might not have Eric Kendricks this week, and that means your matchup is with Chad Greenway, who David Johnson is much faster than, not just in the running game, but in the receiving game as well.
Right.
And so they've got lots of weapons that are going to use the middle of the field, and he can swing out of the backfield and make plays there. That's where Kendricks has come in and been so valuable to this team with his speed and tracking those running backs down. He's not in. Man, I don't know how you go about stopping David Johnson, not just in the running game, which has been successful for Vikings opponents, but stopping him out of the backfield and passing as well.
Quick prediction before we end this video. I think this is maybe their toughest matchup in a couple of weeks, maybe since Philadelphia, at least on paper. Because we saw, Chicago took it to them, and then they lost in Detroit, they lost to Washington. So that's not to say that those other teams didn't stand a chance, but on paper anyway, the Cardinals matchup looks to me like the most difficult since at least Philadelphia 4 weeks ago. Do the Vikings have a chance to straighten out their ship and get back to their winning ways this weekend?
Other than the Chicago game, every one of those games was there to win.
Sure.
The Philadelphia game, they failed in the red zone.
Yep.
In the Detroit game, a bunch of stuff had to happen. A guy had to make a 58-yard field goal. They had to come through with 23 seconds left. And then in the Washington game, you're driving with the ball on the final drive with a chance to go ahead and win the game, assuming that Blair Walsh could have made the extra point, which is a big assumption. But every one of those games, you're right in it, and you just have to get over that hump a little bit. And with Arizona, it's going to be another tough matchup. What they have in common with Philadelphia is great defense. And Chandler Jones coming off the end, that's going to be very difficult for them. And that's the edge rushers have really given problems all season long to this Vikings offense. They will again this week, but it is not just a one-dimensional defense that has one or two good players. It is a stacked defense for Arizona.
Yep.
They can win the game. There's no question that they can. And Arizona's had its own bumps in the road this year, but considering how their defense is, I think it's a challenge.
Sure. He's Matthew Coller. I'm Derek Wetmore. Thanks for watching this week's Vikes Insight. We'll catch you later.